He lifted his thermos for a familiar sunrise sip, and never completed the motion. When searchers arrived, the cup was still warm, steam rising into a forest that refused to answer where he went. His final footprint froze mid-step, and his camera kept recording long after he disappeared, capturing something tall and faceless watching the ridge. On this trail, it isn't the hike that's dangerous. It's the moment you stop. The trail was familiar to him in a way few places were. He knew each bend, every exposed root, the unusual angle of certain trees, the spots where frost clung longer than it should, even in warmer seasons. It was not just a place he visited, it was a landscape he understood intimately. So when the search team found his thermos left open on a large flat rock near the ridge, its contents still warm enough to release a thin ribbon of steam into the cold morning air, they immediately realized something had gone terribly wrong. Thomas was not careless. He never left his gear scattered, never walked away from a hot drink, and certainly never placed his belongings in a way that suggested he would return only moments later. But that was exactly how the scene appeared, as though he had set the thermos down, lifted it for a sip, placed it gently back onto the rock, and then stepped away mid-thought, never to take another. His backpack sat a few feet behind the rock, propped neatly against a small pine. Both shoulder straps were upright, uncrushed, as though he had just removed it seconds earlier. The zipper was fully closed, no items missing, and his gloves, worn but clean, were folded beside the pack with a precision that made every ranger pause. Nothing was scattered, nothing toppled, nothing misplaced. It looked less like a hiker interrupted by danger, and more like a man who simply vanished between one breath and the next. The early morning air was still crisp enough to hold the warmth of his coffee, yet replaced by an unsettling quiet that did not match the time of day. Dawn birds should have been stirring. Branches should have carried the soft rustling of squirrels. But instead, the forest sat in a stillness that felt unnervingly complete. When investigators leaned closer to the thermos, the warmth radiating from the metal provided a disturbing timestamp. If Thomas had left it moments before disappearing, the steam should have dissipated quickly. But according to sunrise hikers who stumbled upon the scene, nearly an hour had passed since the ridge first received enough light to reveal the subtle gleam of stainless steel. Even with a well-insulated container, the temperature was too high for the time that had elapsed. The presence of residual heat suggested either Thomas had vanished far more recently than initial estimates, or the thermos had been exposed to some external warmth after he was gone. Neither explanation was comforting. The rock beneath the thermos also revealed a detail that unsettled the team. Dew-coated everything around the ridge that morning, but the surface of the rock directly surrounding the thermos remained dry in a perfect circular radius. The pattern was not large, only a few inches, but clean enough to raise questions. Natural heat alone would not have created such a precise, dry patch, especially not in the pre-dawn chill. And yet, the dryness extended outward just far enough to suggest something warm had hovered or rested there besides the thermos itself. When the team slid their hands across the stone, they noted a faint temperature difference, barely perceptible, but present. Further inspection revealed the first physical clue of Thomas's routine that morning: a faint imprint of a cup bottom pressed into a patch of moss on the ground. This suggested he had set the thermos down gently, possibly preparing to take his first sip. The imprint was too clean, too perfectly shaped to be accidental. It matched the base of his thermos exactly. But the imprint also carried a chilling implication. If Thomas had placed the thermos on the moss before transferring it to the rock, why did the moss beneath remain undisturbed? Why did the cup imprint look as fresh as the rock imprint? And why did the moss inside the ring appear slightly lifted along the edges, as though briefly insulated by a thin pocket of warm air. Rangers combed the area for footprints, expecting at least the telltale depressions of Thomas's boots. But the ground around the rock was unusually firm, and only a partial tread mark existed, near the base of the pine. It looked incomplete, as though he had stepped lightly or only applied half his weight. The absence of a second, corresponding print suggested he had paused, mid-motion, possibly turning or shifting direction. The forest floor remained undisturbed beyond that single partial impression, leaving no indication of where he had walked next. It was as if he had either taken one step and vanished, or never completed the motion at all. The search team also noted the absence of condensation around the thermos lid. Given the temperature contrast between the coffee and the mountain air, moisture should have formed quickly. Yet the lid remained dry. The lip of the thermos carried a faint smudge, consistent with contact, but no dripping or pooling appeared on the metal's outer rim. This detail suggested Thomas had indeed lifted the thermos, possibly taken a sip, and set it down with deliberate calm. Nothing about the setup suggested panic. If anything, it suggested he had been entirely unaware of anything unusual in the moments leading to his disappearance. The forest surrounding the ridge, however, conveyed something different. As investigators moved outward in expanding circles, they noticed a thin layer of frost clinging to leaves in irregular patches. Not enough to coat the entire forest, just certain clusters, as if cold air had pooled in pockets independent of natural airflow. One ranger commented that the ridge felt as though two temperatures overlapped, warm and cold zones existing inches apart. It reflected the same pattern observed around the thermos, the juxtaposition of warm objects and cold spaces. The ridge did not behave like a consistent environment. It behaved like a fractured one. Dawn hikers who discovered the scene also mentioned something that investigators could not easily dismiss. They heard a faint metallic tap before seeing the thermos. They could not identify the source. It was a single, soft sound resembling metal brushed lightly by something, not wind, not falling debris, something deliberate. The hikers described feeling watched in those seconds, though they saw no one on the ridge. As investigators analyzed photographs taken by the first responders, one detail froze the room. Behind the thermos, in the soft blur of pre-sunrise shadows, a tall, distorted shape hovered, faintly between two trees. Its outline was not consistent with a person or an animal. It looked stretched, elongated, almost as if light itself bent around it. When the image was enhanced, the blurred shape revealed a faint curve where a face should be, except there were no features at all. Just a smooth surface leaning toward the thermos, as if studying the warmth Thomas left behind before his disappearance. Thomas Rayner was the kind of man whose habits were so predictable that his absence felt like a disruption in the natural rhythm of the community itself. At 67, he lived a life shaped by structure, routine, and the quiet discipline learned through decades as a forest surveyor. Even after retirement, he continued waking before dawn, brewing coffee with practiced precision, and stepping onto local trails as though the wilderness were an extension of his home. Those who knew Thomas described him as the steady type, calm, methodical, grounded. He was not the sort of person who got lost, who took risks without preparation, or who stepped away from his belongings without reason. That was why the scene at Red Hollow Ridge felt so deeply unsettling. Nothing about Thomas matched the chaos implied by vanishing mid-sip. Everything about him pointed toward a man who would never leave a thermos open unless something extraordinary interrupted him. Thomas grew up in a small mountain town community where nature was both playground and teacher. As a child, he learned to track changing weather through the shape of clouds, to understand the temperament of the woods by the direction of wind, to spot subtle differences in soil and moss that hinted at animal movements. These skills followed him into adulthood, eventually guiding him into a career in forestry. For decades, he studied terrain shifts, tree growth cycles, and the impact of climate on wildlife patterns. The forest was not just familiar to him. It was a living system he could read like other people read language. In many ways, he moved through the woods with an ease that felt inherited, as though the land trusted him. Retirement did not dull his instincts. Instead, it gave him freedom to choose his own paths. Always early, always quiet, always alone. Sunrise hours were his sanctuary, the time when the world felt most honest. He kept meticulous notes in small field journals he carried in his jacket pocket, documenting everything from unusual bird routes to temperature anomalies. His handwriting was tight and consistent, each page evidence of a mind that observed before it acted. These journals would later become crucial pieces of the investigation. Not because they explained where Thomas went, but because they revealed what he was thinking in the days leading up to his disappearance. Those final notes suggested a shift in his perception, a subtle unease creeping into a man who rarely allowed imagination to influence judgment. One entry, written 2 weeks earlier, mentioned silence pockets along certain trails where wind patterns died unnaturally. Another referenced an odd echo delay when he called out to a distant ridge. Thomas did not dramatize. He did not embellish. For him to record these observations meant they were noticeable enough to break his usual pattern of confident certainty. His family later said he had become more contemplative, sometimes pausing mid-conversation as though listening to something beyond the room. He never described fear, but he described awareness, an awareness that the forest he loved had begun behaving in ways he couldn't fully explain. Neighbors noticed his behavior shift slightly too. Thomas, usually brisk and focused, had developed a habit of pausing in his driveway before stepping into his truck each morning. He would glance toward the tree line behind his house, lingering for just a breath longer than usual, not with suspicion but with a kind of cautious curiosity. One neighbor recalled seeing him standing in the backyard at dawn, motionless, his coffee steaming in the cold air as he looked toward the woods. She greeted him, but he didn't respond immediately. He seemed lost in thought, as if studying a pattern only he could see. When he finally turned toward her, he smiled and waved, brushing away the moment with a warmth that hid whatever had held his attention. Moments earlier, his family, especially his daughter, noticed something else, a hint of excitement woven into his unease. Thomas had always loved discovering small mysteries in the natural world, odd tree markings, rare bird migrations, unusual fog clusters that settled low to the ground. But in recent weeks, his conversations carried an undercurrent of anticipation, as though he felt something significant stirring in the forest. He mentioned feeling watched during an early hike but dismissed the sensation as his mind playing tricks. Yet he recorded the moment in his journal, anyway, marking it with a single line, something aware nearby. Not animal, not threat, just present. This line would trouble investigators later, because it suggested something subtle but deliberate had captured his attention. Thomas did not attribute awareness lightly. For him, awareness implied intention. The fact he felt observed without feeling threatened indicated the presence, whatever it was, did not behave like wildlife. It didn't stalk, didn't hide, didn't announce itself. It occupied space quietly, acknowledging him without crossing into aggression. This suggested that his disappearance was not the result of panic or accident. Instead, it hinted toward an encounter with something that mirrored curiosity rather than danger. His fitness level also ruled out many natural explanations. Despite his age, Thomas was remarkably strong and agile. He maintained a consistent exercise routine, hiked several miles weekly, and had no medical issues affecting mobility or balance. He carried a GPS-enabled watch, kept emergency supplies in his pack, and always informed someone of his route. All these measures reflected a man who valued preparedness, who respected the wilderness enough to never underestimate it. For someone like him to disappear without leaving a trail contradicted everything his experience represented. The investigators also paid attention to his hiking gear, worn but reliable. His boots left distinct impressions in softer terrain, and his watch logged steady heart rate patterns during his morning hikes. But data from his final outing revealed something unusual. Moments before his recorded steps ended, his heart rate spiked, not in panic or exertion, but in a sharp burst of adrenaline. The spike was too brief to indicate fear. It was the kind of response a person might experience upon sudden discovery, as if he saw something unexpected and fascinating. This reaction aligned disturbingly well with his final journal entry. "Something is waking earlier than I do." Investigators believe Thomas may have encountered the same presence hinted at by the distorted shape in the enhanced photo, a presence that didn't chase him, but watched him. A presence that stood close enough to interrupt his next thought, his next step, his next sip of coffee. And whatever he saw was enough to make him pause, and simply not continue. His final belonging provided one last clue. In the pocket of his hiking jacket, searchers found a small piece of torn paper. The edges were ragged, as if ripped in haste. Yet the handwriting on it remained neat and deliberate. It read, "It's closer today." The sentence ended abruptly, cut off, before he could finish the thought. Whether he was interrupted or simply distracted, no one knew. But what mattered most was what investigators found on the back of that torn paper. A faint, oily smudge shaped like a fingertip, far larger than Thomas's own. Red Hollow Ridge had long been regarded as one of the region's most dependable trails, the kind that seasoned hikers trusted and newcomers admired for its straightforward beauty. It was predictable in its terrain, familiar in its seasonal shifts, and known for a calm that set in well before the first rays of sunlight touched the tree canopy. For decades, it served as a quiet sanctuary, offering nothing more than winding dirt paths, pine, scented air, and sweeping overlooks that made even the most restless hikers pause. Yet in the months leading up to Thomas Rayner's disappearance, subtle changes began creeping across the ridge. Changes, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable to those who knew the land intimately. Rangers noticed it, early morning joggers mentioned it, and Thomas himself had documented the shift in his journals. Something beneath the surface of Red Hollow Ridge had begun altering its behavior, as though the landscape itself were adjusting to an unseen influence. To the casual hiker, the ridge still looked normal, even welcoming, but the forest's reactions betrayed a growing irregularity. Wildlife, usually active in the pre-dawn hours, began avoiding the central portion of the trail. Birds altered their flight paths, circling wider arcs rather than passing above the ridge's narrow saddle. Squirrels that normally darted across the path in frantic bursts now lingered at the tree line, hesitant to venture deeper. Even the deer that frequented the clearing near the first switchback had stopped grazing there, their tracks disappearing entirely from that section of the forest floor. The absence of movement was subtle, but consistent, an unnatural stillness slowly overtaking an area that had always thrived with early morning life. Rangers initially blamed weather patterns. A late-season cold front had passed through weeks earlier, and while it wasn't unusual for sudden climate shifts to influence wildlife, the behavior around Red Hollow Ridge felt disconnected from temperature alone. This wasn't a temporary migration or a reaction to environmental stress. It felt targeted, localized, as though something specific to the ridge's upper section discouraged animals from venturing near it. Experienced rangers knew that wildlife often sensed disturbances long before humans did. When animals began avoiding the ridge entirely, it became harder to dismiss the shift as coincidence. One ranger who had patrolled the area for 17 years, described walking the trail and suddenly realizing that his footsteps sounded different. Echoes took an extra beat to return, stretching unnervingly, as if bouncing off surfaces farther away than before. Another ranger reported that her voice echoed twice when she called out to a coworker, an impossible phenomenon in an open, forest environment. The ridge had never behaved like a canyon or rocky amphitheater, yet certain pockets now amplified and distorted sound in ways the terrain didn't support. These auditory anomalies appeared exclusively in the same half-mile radius where Thomas disappeared, reinforcing the sense that the ridge was undergoing changes no one could fully map. Ridge shift incidents soon followed. After a heavy rainstorm, trail maintenance crews found that a section of the path had subtly curved in a direction it had never curved before. Not washed out, not eroded, curved. The earth hadn't given way. Instead, it seemed repositioned, subtly recontoured, as though lifted and set down differently. Footpath edges that had once followed a predictable line now angled noticeably toward the slope. Crews assumed the soil had softened and shifted under weight, but soil assessment showed no instability. The path simply existed in a new arrangement. This was not the only structural anomaly. GPS readings from hikers' devices began conflicting with park markers. Coordinates that had always aligned perfectly now drifted slightly off-center. A hiker using a navigation app noticed her location dot hovering several feet away from where she physically stood. Another reported a strange latency between movement and recorded position, each step registering moments later, like a lag between reality and its digital representation. For most users, the glitch was minor. But for people like Thomas, who relied on precise measurements and environmental consistency, these irregularities stood out like warnings. In the weeks before his disappearance, Thomas had sketched several maps in his notebook, marking specific points along the ridge where echoes lagged, where the air felt colder, or where the wind shifted in strange countercurrents. One sketch included a note reading, "Same shape, every time. Oval zone. Feels like walking into a bubble." He hadn't elaborated on what that bubble felt like. But the circular patterns near the ridge would later correlate with both his final location and the anomalies found around his thermos. Even more unsettling were reports from a small group of hikers who camped near the ridge earlier in the season. They claimed to have witnessed the tree line shifting subtly after dusk, not swaying, not flickering under wind, but repositioning. According to their account, the trees appeared to stand in slightly different formations between one glance and the next, as though the forest rearranged its alignment behind them. They initially dismissed the sensation as fatigue or low light distortion, but one hiker later insisted that the ridge was breathing, expanding and contracting with a rhythm too slow to be wind-driven. Their report was never officially filed, but word of it spread among the ranger staff, adding to the growing sense that the ridge held a presence watching from behind its own structure. The most alarming change, however, came not from the behavior of trees or wildlife, but from the ridge's tendency to alter time in small, unsettling increments. Hikers reported losing minutes without noticing. A sunrise that should have lasted 10 minutes seemed to pass in 2 watches, desynchronized inexplicably. More than one person claimed their digital devices froze briefly, not malfunctioning in the traditional sense, but stalling, as though caught in a brief pause before resuming function. This temporal distortion occurred along the same route Thomas frequented. When investigators compared Thomas's watch logs to the timeline reconstructed by hikers who passed the area that morning, they noticed discrepancies in the recorded time of day, even though the watch itself showed no signs of technical failure. Drone footage provided the most compelling evidence that the ridge was changing in ways invisible from ground level. A sweep conducted over the trail 2 days before Thomas's disappearance showed the path curving gently along its usual contour. A sweep conducted the morning after he vanished showed something different. The trail's outline bent at a sharper angle near his last known location, as if the terrain had rotated slightly in the night. Lighting, conditions, camera angles, and drone positioning were carefully reviewed to rule out distortion. But the conclusion was clear: the ridge wasn't just shifting. It was rearranging itself in ways subtle enough to go unnoticed, but significant enough to alter the landscape's geometry. This pattern alarmed investigators for a reason that went beyond the physical shifts. The ridge didn't simply behave differently, it behaved responsively. It changed after disturbances, after storms, after human presence lingered too long. The alterations didn't reflect chaos, they reflected intention. The land felt as though it were resetting itself, erasing traces, realigning pathways. And Thomas Raynor, with his early hikes and observational nature, may have noticed these changes too closely. Close enough to stand exactly where the ridge's behavior began to intensify. As investigators stared at the drone footage, comparing the ridge before and after Thomas disappeared, they noticed one more detail. One that chilled even the most experienced ranger on the team. In the post-disappearance footage, at the precise location where Thomas's thermos had been found, the trail's new curvature cast a faint shadow that didn't align with any tree or rock. The shadow stood tall, narrow, and perfectly upright. When they enhanced the footage, the shadow remained, but the trees around it did not cast anything even remotely resembling its shape, as if something else had stood there that morning, watching the drone from below. The discovery of Thomas Raynor's thermos should have been a simple detail in a missing person case, just an object abandoned during a moment of distraction or a sudden slip. But the more investigators examined it, the more the thermos became the center of something no one could quite explain. Every detail surrounding it contradicted natural behavior, and every temperature reading, imprint, and environmental clue suggested that whatever happened to Thomas did not align with any ordinary disappearance. The thermos was still warm when found. It wasn't supposed to be. The air was cold enough to frost grass tips, and the morning had stretched long enough for the metal to cool significantly. Yet warmth lingered, as if the object had been held only moments earlier or exposed to a source of heat that didn't belong in a pre-sunrise forest. And it wasn't just the warmth. The thermos sat perfectly upright, lid open, coffee level undisturbed. As if Thomas had placed it down with deliberate care before vanishing. In the middle of a breath. Investigators approached the thermos as a timeline marker. If it was still warm, then Thomas must have been there minutes before discovery. Or something had interacted with it after he was gone. Temperature readings showed an internal heat level that should have dropped dramatically overnight. The fact that it remained at a near fresh warmth suggested a disturbance within a 30-minute window. But according to sunrise hikers who first found the site, the ridge was empty when they arrived. No figure walked the trail. No movement stirred the surrounding trees. The hikers saw the thermos steaming from a distance, the thin vapor rising straight into the still air, forming a faint plume that dissipated before reaching the higher branches. The steam behaved unnaturally slowly, rising in a controlled drift despite the cold. One hiker later described the steam as hesitant, as though lifting into air that resisted its movement. The rock beneath the thermos added another layer of mystery. The dew that blanketed the area had settled evenly across stones, leaves, and forest floor, except for the dry ring around the thermos. A clean, circular patch remained untouched by moisture, as if heat had radiated outward in a perfect radius. The shape was too symmetrical to be accidental. Investigators measured the circle repeatedly, each time finding the diameter identical, 6 inches, round as a manufactured stamp. Natural heat dispersion could never create such precision. And even more perplexing was the temperature variation itself. The outer edges of the rock held the expected chill of early morning. But the center, directly under the thermos, felt faintly warmer. Not enough to be obvious, but unmistakable under careful touch. It was the kind of warmth that lingered when something with consistent heat had recently occupied the space. The thermos's lid told its own story. Though open, no condensation clung to its rim. Any warm object exposed to cold dawn air should have collected moisture quickly, yet the surface remained dry. Investigators analyzed its lip for residue and discovered a faint streak consistent with contact, likely the touch of Thomas's mouth or glove. But the absence of condensation implied the lid had been opened recently, not hours earlier. And that contradicted the fact that Thomas should have opened it long before the hikers arrived. Every detail suggested the thermos had been lifted, held, and replaced close to the moment it was discovered. Yet the last recorded step on Thomas's hiking watch occurred nearly an hour beforehand. Then there was the moss imprint. A few feet from the rock. A perfect circular depression marked where the thermos had briefly sat. The moss inside the circle was slightly flattened, its shape crisp and undisturbed. Normally, such an imprint would soften quickly as the moss rose back into place. But this one remained in a preserved state, long after it should have regained its natural texture. That meant the thermos had been placed there recently. But investigators couldn't match that timeline with any known movement. No footprints led to the moss. No scuffs in the soil indicated motion. It was as if the thermos had been set down lightly, then lifted and moved to the rock without leaving any evidence of navigation between the points. The forest floor preserved subtleties. The trail was too consistent, the soil too fine, to hide such movement. Yet there was nothing. Nearby vegetation hinted at something even stranger. Pine needles scattered around the rock lay in unusual positions, some pointing inward toward the thermos, instead of outward in natural, random patterns. A ranger kneeling beside the rock noted that the needles felt slightly warm to the touch, as if briefly exposed to a heat pocket. The pattern resembled a gentle inward pull, rather than a gust of wind or falling debris. It gave the impression of an invisible presence, passing near the thermos, shifting air pressure just enough to alter leaf alignment. That observation alone convinced several investigators that the warmth surrounding the thermos was not solely from its contents, but from an interaction with the environment, an interaction that left no clear trace except these subtle deviations. The watch data added yet another layer of contradiction. Moments before Thomas's recorded steps ceased, his heart rate spiked dramatically. Not a fierce spike, those displayed differently, but a sharp surge consistent with sudden discovery or intense focus. His heart rate returned to baseline almost immediately, then flatlined in terms of motion data. It was as though he had paused mid-action. Perhaps he saw something unexpected, something that held his attention fully, something that caused him to set the thermos down while his mind tried to process the moment. That explanation aligned with the neatness of the scene. The controlled placement of the thermos, the centered orientation of the backpack, the carefully folded gloves. Nothing suggested panic. Everything suggested interruption. One ranger, reviewing the scene, noticed an anomaly that others overlooked. The steam rising from the thermos bent slightly to the left, not due to wind, but as if drawn toward a subtle distortion in the air. The distortion was invisible, but the steam's movement revealed it, a thin, wavering path as if the air density had shifted. He recorded a short video, and when investigators reviewed the footage, they saw the same bending pattern. It wasn't dramatic, but it was deliberate, consistent, and unexplainable. The final detail came from environmental scanning equipment brought in later that afternoon. A thermal sweep revealed a faint residual heat signature behind the rock. The outline was tall, far taller than Thomas, and vaguely human-shaped. The shape stood directly behind the thermos location, as if something had been leaning over him or the object, studying it. The signature was too warm to be a ghost imprint and too structured to be random environmental noise. And, importantly, it appeared in an area where no one had stood. Investigators reviewed the scan repeatedly, hoping to dismiss it as equipment error. But the shape remained clear enough to define shoulders, a curved upper frame, and an elongated vertical orientation inconsistent with any known wildlife. And when they enhanced the scan to isolate heat layers, they saw something else, another, smaller, colder outline directly in front of the larger one, shaped like a person mid-step. But the legs faded completely, as if the imprint had never finished forming. The first search teams believed the strange warmth around Thomas Rayner's thermos was the most unsettling part of the investigation, until sound technicians arrived and discovered the ridge wasn't silent at all. It was communicating, not in words, not in any language that belonged to humans or wildlife, but in rhythmic, layered signals that responded to movement and presence. Red Hollow Ridge had always been known for its quiet mornings, but the quiet that pressed against investigators the day after Thomas vanished felt wrong. It wasn't the stillness of a peaceful forest. It was the stillness of something listening. And once they brought in recording devices to study the environment, the ridge reacted as though it had been waiting for someone to pay attention. The first sound anomaly surfaced when a ranger's body mic captured a low, vibrating hum while he walked the perimeter of Thomas's last known spot. At first glance, a hum resembled interference, an audio glitch from cheap equipment. But when analyzed in the lab tent, the hum displayed structure. It held pitch modulation, like a slow breath drawn through a narrow opening. It rose and fell with impossible consistency, too organized to be background noise. Even stranger, the ranger hadn't heard the hum directly. To him, the ridge had been completely silent. Only the microphone picked it up. This discrepancy, the disconnect between what the human ear perceived and what the device recorded, became the first sign that the ridge carried two layers of sound, one audible and one buried in frequencies only technology could detect. When investigators deployed a series of motion-triggered recorders throughout the ridge's central zone, the pattern became clearer. Every time someone stepped into the half-mile radius where Thomas disappeared, the ridge responded with the same low hum. But it didn't react to every movement. It responded to pauses. Whenever an investigator stopped walking, stood still, looked around, took in the environment, the hum grew slightly louder. Not drastically, but enough to indicate correlation rather than coincidence. The ridge wasn't sensitive to footsteps. It was sensitive to awareness, stillness, observation, the same behavior Thomas displayed. Every morning when he paused to drink his coffee and listen to the forest breathe, the next stage of the anomaly appeared in the form of delayed echoes. On the morning of the third day, a ranger called out to a colleague 20 yards away. She expected her voice to return, faintly from the opposite slope, as it always did. Instead, her words echoed twice, once, immediately, another a beat later, softer and slightly distorted. The second echo carried a strange pitch shift, like her tone had been stretched and replayed. The ranger froze mid-step. Her colleague called out again, this time purposefully, and once again a double echo responded. The second echo didn't match the terrain. It sounded layered, artificial, almost as though the ridge itself were replaying her voice with a different resonance. Sound technicians analyzed the recordings and found that the second echoes didn't originate from a physical surface. They appeared to bloom within the air itself, forming without reflection. It was as if something invisible absorbed the ranger's voice, held it momentarily, then released it in a warped imitation. The discrepancy startled the team. Natural echoes require surfaces. This echo required presence. An entity or phenomenon capable of receiving sound, then returning it. But the most unsettling recording came from a device placed directly beside the rock where Thomas's thermos had been found. During a 20-minute window when no one stood near the ridge, the recorder captured faint breathing. It wasn't human breathing. Human breath carries irregular patterns, small stutters, shifts in pace, unconscious pauses. This breathing was slow, measured, impossibly steady. It inhaled and exhaled in long intervals, maintaining a rhythm that no human naturally sustained. Even more disturbing, the breathing grew louder whenever a person entered the edge of the radius, as though acknowledging their presence from afar. Technicians enhanced the audio and discovered something chilling beneath the primary breath. A second breath. Softer, closer to human cadence. Shallow in comparison, but unmistakably present. Analysts compared the secondary breath to Thomas's medical records and found similarities in rhythm, age, related pattern, and lung capacity variance. Though not definitive, the breath felt familiar. It suggested one of two possibilities. Either Thomas had been breathing near the rock after the time of his disappearance, or the ridge had captured his breath in some way, replaying it the same way it replayed the ranger's echoes. Soft, stretched, distorted. This reinforced a troubling theory, shared quietly among the investigators. Red Hollow Ridge didn't simply absorb sound. It retained it. And in some cases, it returned it. Other recordings from the ridge showed additional anomalies. Leaves rustled in sequences that didn't match one direction. A vibration passed through the soil in a perfect wave pattern, smooth, controlled, almost like a pulse. Investigators pressed their palms against tree trunks and felt a faint trembling, as if something beneath the bark shifted. But when they stepped away, the trembling stopped. The ridge behaved like an entity reacting to human proximity, responding only when someone lingered. Dogs brought in for search support refused to enter the central radius. They circled the perimeter anxiously, tails low, ears pinned back. When coaxed forward, they pulled their handlers away, reacting with refusal rather than fear. Dogs didn't see a predator, they sensed an environment that wasn't natural. Animals avoided the ridge long before humans noticed anything. Now, even trained search dogs resisted stepping into the echo zone. Grounding themselves like the earth itself had warned them to stay away. Multiple investigators reported hearing soft whisper-like sounds in the distance. Not distinct words, but vibrations shaped enough to imply intention. One ranger described the sound as almost speech, but incomplete, like someone trying to form a word without vocal cords. Another said it was similar to hearing a thought from outside your head. These descriptions, vague as they were, matched Thomas's journal entries where he wrote about feeling nearby awareness, without identifying its source. Whatever had drawn Thomas's attention in his final days seemed to be the same presence, now responding to investigators. Then came the strangest detail of all. During an audio sweep around the location of the thermos, the recording device picked up faint footsteps, crunching lightly through leaves. The pattern matched Thomas's gait. The spacing matched his stride distance. But the timeline didn't match his disappearance. The footsteps occurred hours after he had supposedly vanished. And, worst of all, the footsteps continued beyond the point where his physical footprints ended, walking calmly into untouched soil without leaving any marks behind. It was sound without body, movement without presence. A trace of something that should not have existed. Investigators replayed the audio repeatedly, each time struck by the same realization. The footsteps didn't fade naturally. They ended abruptly, replaced by the faintest exhale, deep, heavy, close to the microphone. It was the same heavy breath captured earlier. The breath of the unseen watcher. Just as investigators prepared to shut down the recorders for the night. One device captured a slow whisper, layered behind the hum. 4 soft syllables stretched thin, sounding eerily like a voice forming Thomas Rayner's name. The search team had studied Thomas Rayner's last known location from every angle, analyzing the warmth of the thermos, the strange patterns in the dew, and the echoes that answered back from empty air. But nothing unnerved them as deeply as the moment they traced his actual footsteps along Red Hollow Ridge. Footprints are supposed to tell a story, direction, pace, hesitation, or panic. They're a record of a person's movement through time and terrain. But Thomas's prints defied every rule. They began normally, walked normally, and then ended in a way that no trained investigator had ever seen. His final step didn't diminish. It didn't blur. It didn't shift direction. It simply stopped mid-stride, as if gravity itself had paused around him, and refused to let him finish placing his foot on the ground. The prints started at the trail entrance, exactly where Thomas's routine always began. Each boot mark landed with the consistency of someone who knew the path well. No dragging, no missteps, no deviations. His stride length matched his usual gait. He wasn't fatigued. He wasn't rushing. His pace reflected comfort born from years of familiarity. As investigators followed the trail, they noticed something else. The soil held his prints unusually well, almost too well. The ridge's surface normally shifted under early frost, softening footprints within hours. But Thomas's prints remained preserved with startling clarity, the edges crisp, the impressions deep enough to appear fresh. Heat loss should have hardened the soil and erased detail. Yet the marks looked as if they were made minutes earlier. It was as though the ground had chosen to keep the shape of his feet intact. The prints remained steady until they reached a clearing where the ridge widened into a subtle plateau. It was the spot Thomas frequently paused at, an area where the mountains opened up in a sweeping view of the valley. Investigators believed he may have taken a moment to appreciate the landscape before turning toward the rock to drink his coffee. That theory felt comforting, logical, human. But the evidence carried none of that logic. As they approached the clearing, the air grew noticeably colder, matching the same pocket, like temperature anomalies Thomas had documented in his notes. The wind didn't flow through the space naturally. It felt redirected, curling strangely along the perimeter, rather than crossing through the open area. Even the birds that usually circled overhead remained distant. Thomas's footprints continued toward the center of the clearing, then changed. The second to last footprint appeared perfectly normal. Full weight, deep impression. The next footprint, the final one, told a different story. It was incomplete. The heel pressed into the soil, but the ball of the foot and toes never touched down. It looked like a moment frozen in motion, as if he had begun to step forward, but never finished shifting his weight. The print captured, transitioned down to the smallest detail, the precise angle of his boot, the lightness at the front, the sense of an unfinished movement suspended in time, and then nothing. Beyond that half step, the ground was pristine. No scuffs, no disrupted leaves, no secondary impressions. The trail simply stopped recording him. Investigators circled the clearing, expecting to see some indication of where he had gone next. But the ground remained untouched, no signs of fall, slip, or retreat. The soil held a strange firmness that seemed to reject new impressions. A ranger pressed his boot firmly into the earth, near the final print. His weight barely dented the surface. It was as if the ground had settled into an unnatural stillness after Thomas disappeared, locking itself into place the moment his last step ended. The surrounding leaves formed a delicate pattern, not scattered, not crushed, but arranged in a way that made investigators uneasy, almost as if wind had passed through in a circular motion, sweeping them gently into a spiral around the clearing's center. That spiral pattern didn't match natural airflow. It was too symmetrical, too carefully distributed. One ranger, an experienced tracker, said the swirl resembled displacement created when something large moved through the area without touching the ground, as if the presence investigators suspected from the audio recordings had entered the clearing in a way that altered air pressure rather than soil. And when they inspected the outer edges of the spiral, they found slight indentations, round, shallow, evenly spaced. Not from boots, not from wildlife. They resembled impressions left by something distributing weight across multiple points, forming a wide circular contour instead of a recognizable footprint. Investigators mapped these impressions carefully. The pattern matched the same radius found around Thomas's thermos, and when overlaid on the GPS shifts recorded on previous hikes, the locations aligned with the bubble zones Thomas had drawn in his notebook. The clearing wasn't just part of the trail. It was one of the ridge's responsive points, areas where sound, temperature, and space behaved unnaturally. Thomas's disappearance occurred at the center of the largest bubble he had documented. The one he suspected changed in size and shape, depending on the time of day. His final journal entry mentioned something waking earlier than he did. That line echoed in the minds of investigators as they studied the impressions surrounding his last footprint. Then came the analysis of his smartwatch data. The altitude readings from his final march through the ridge spiked in a way that didn't match terrain elevation. In the final seconds before his steps stopped, the watch registered a brief jump in altitude, only a few feet, but sudden and sharp, without any steep incline nearby. The reading didn't suggest he climbed. It suggested he rose. The device recorded the altitude gain, then froze at the same moment his footsteps ended. This anomaly was too precise to ignore. It implied that his body moved upward, even if only briefly, before disappearing entirely from the trail. What unsettled investigators most was the audio recorded near the last footprint. A device, placed 30 feet away, captured soft, crunching noises, footsteps that matched Thomas's exact cadence. But the footsteps continued past the point where his physical tracks ended. They walked calmly, steadily, as though he kept moving in a direction no longer rooted in the ground. The footsteps traveled several more yards, then faded without the sound of deceleration. No impact, no stumble, just disappearance. It was sound without a body, movement without form. Evidence that something carried forward beyond physical space. Investigators replayed the audio until the sequence felt burned into their minds. Step, 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 silence. Then a faint exhale. Deep, heavy, closer than any human breath should have been to the microphone. The same exhale captured earlier when the unseen presence hovered near the thermos. Hours later, when the team attempted to recreate the echo pattern by speaking near the final footprint, the ridge answered them. A second voice, not human, returned their call, shape shifted by stretched resonance. It wasn't speech, but it was deliberate, as if something recognized their presence exactly where Thomas had stood. As the team prepared to leave the clearing, one investigator spotted a new imprint forming beside Thomas's final half step, round, deep, and appearing in the soil as if pressed by an invisible force.